very quickly review last time. I started with this thought, not even a hypothesis necessarily, that maybe the children of Israel that we're going to talk about in a little bit were such whiners because it just kind of came to them naturally through years and years, generations and generations of people who were kind of like them. I don't think they just became whiners when they were freed from bondage. Probably were whiners all along and probably learned to whine from their parents, who learned from their parents, and so on. So we were talking about that just a little bit. We talked about the construction of the family of Jacob and his children and how that was potentially kind of one of the sources or the seeds of this dysfunction of the nation of Israel. And if we look at how Jacob's family grew, it was by being given the wrong wife that he didn't love, and then a week later getting the right wife, but having to work for 14 years to do that. Having his wife that he didn't love have children, and his wife who he did love unable to have children. And then having them both hand over their servants or their slaves to have more children. And then finally, we see that Rachel had a son, Joseph, and then a second, and then she died. So the construction of this family has a lot of dysfunction within it. And I'm no scholar on ancient Near Eastern culture, but I imagine that this family was probably, even by those standards, maybe a little dysfunctional. And certainly the story of Joseph, which we'll talk about in a bit, we see that come out for sure. We talked about Jacob when he fled to his future father-in-law, to Laban, his uncle, and he lived there. Things were going really well, professionally speaking. His flocks were increasing, his wealth was growing, Laban's wealth was growing, but there was discontent. And Jacob eventually ended up leaving. Of course, was also told by God it's time to go, but it was time to go regardless. And so on the way out, Rachel stole his household gods. Never really told why in the scriptures she did that little weird thing that she did, and then she lied about it. Talked about, we got into this conversation about Jacob having to confront his past, and he had to come back, and he was going to have to deal with Esau. He ran away 20 years prior because Esau was going to kill him, and with good reason. Maybe not justifiable today in our legal system, but certainly back in those days probably had a good reason to kill him. And so Jacob has to go back and he has to deal with this. And we see that he has started to make preparations. He's split his party into two. He set aside a whole bunch of livestock to give to Esau, and he is preparing in every way he can for the worst case scenario. Maybe the assumption that Esau is going to attack him because he was told that Esau was coming and he had a lot of men. He had an army with him. And so Jacob is trying to figure out, what do I do? So he just splits things up, he lays out some gifts, and he's going to try to potentially buy his safety. Of course, he prayed to God, and then we have this very interesting short story of Jacob being by himself for a while, for a night, and he has a wrestling match with God, which I still think is bizarre. I don't fully understand how God had to wrestle with him all night. Could have beat him in a moment, but they had this match. Finally, God touches his hip and dislocates it, and it hurts terribly, but Jacob won't give up till he gets a blessing. And so God tells him, you got your blessing, I'm going to name you Israel now, which means to struggle, because you struggled with God, you struggled with man. And so he's got this brand new limb that he walks with. And then we've got to this point where he is now having to face it. And in the story, Jacob is out front, and he has stacked all of his people behind him. And who did he put at the very back of the line? Rachel and Joseph. He put his favorites back there, put them at the back. Possibly he could have done it because he was putting them in the order they were born. I don't know. But I tend to think that he was protecting Rachel and Joseph from them. But nevertheless, the time had come. He had to meet him. He had to confront him. 20 years had gone by. He's prayed about it. He's had this epic wrestling match with God. He's made every provision he can. But the moment has still come. And have you ever found yourself in a situation, you've done all you can do in the face of something dire or scary. You've done everything you can do, and now it's time to meet the challenge. You ever been in that situation? It's interesting how we respond. I've talked to several people who have had to confront things that were like really scary and terrifying. And some people have said it was worse than I even imagined, but some people have said, of course, it's better than I thought it was going to go. And some people said, I wasn't even thinking. I just went into it, and it's like a person going into battle. They get on autopilot, they just go in. But Esau had to go in. I'm sure he was terrified. I'm sure this took a lot of courage. And how did he approach Esau when they were coming together? Jacob and his family and Esau and his army of men. Remember what Jacob did? Yeah. He fell down and he bowed. And what did Esau do? Esau, we're told, ran and hugged him. And he cries out, my brother, You think Jacob was expecting that? I certainly don't. Maybe he was hopeful it would be like, we're going to have a negotiation here. I've got some territory and you're not going to come here. And I don't think he expected that at all. And so Esau is hugging him. He's telling him, get up. He's hugging him. He's calling him his brother. And then he says, what's the deal with all these animals you gave me? And Jacob is like, I wanted to give you a blessing out of what God has given me. And he's like, I don't need them. I have tons of animals. And he says, tell me about all these people. He said, these are my children and my wives and these other ladies I've been with. And Esau says, I have a big family too. And I have a lot going on. And so they catch up very quickly. And Esau, throughout this conversation, is trying to insert himself into Jacob's life. Let me go with you. Let me leave some people with you. Let me help you. And Jacob's response each time is, no. I'll slow you down. I'm fine. You keep going. I'll catch up with you. I don't need you to lead people. I'll work it out on my own. And it was very interesting to me that, at least in my thoughts, anticipating this, if this was a movie, and I'd never seen this before, or read it or heard it, anticipating that moment is pretty good. But Esau had the exact opposite reaction that I suspect Jacob was thinking he would have. So I'm going to say I think Esau handled this better. Certainly he handled it better than Jacob thought he would, but I think he was much more gracious. Now Jacob, of course, was offering him a lot, and Jacob was trying to be humble towards him. They both handled it well. Certainly no confrontation. But I think, given the expectations, Esau did a really good job. And there's a lesson in there for us, isn't there? That if you're the one on the other side, and you're wronged, and you're gravely offended, perhaps there's a lesson there from Esau, looking at it from his perspective. But what was conspicuously absent from this meeting, this encounter that the two of them had? What did Jacob not say that we have recorded at least?
He was sorry.
Yeah, he said, hey, sorry for what I did. Sorry for the whole animal skin thing, trying to smell and feel like you, hairy brother. No, he didn't. There was no mention of that. And I'm not sure what to take of that. Obviously, Jacob was meant to have those blessings and have the birthright and all that. But he took those from his brother. And so it's interesting, it's not recorded, any conversation about that. And of course, maybe Jacob was smart and realized, well, Esau didn't bring it up, so I'm not gonna kick over that angle unless I have to. So, but that was absent. No apology, no explanation, no even passing mention of it. They just had this meeting, went very well, and then they parted ways. We'll skip over all of this. I think you probably get much of that. And then we get to this, we have a couple interludes in the story of Jacob and and then into the story of Joseph. And one is Genesis chapter 34, where Jacob's only daughter that is mentioned, Dinah, there's a Shechem, who is the son of Hamor, who lives in Shechem, is smitten with her. And of course, he ends up raping her. But he professes that he loves her and he wants her to be his wife. And so, of course, that doesn't go over well with Jacob's sons, especially her full brothers. They don't come to that at all. And so you remember the scheme they had, which was, well, we'll allow you to marry her, but first you all have to be circumcised, all the men, because that's what we do. You have to do it too. And so they do that, and then of course we read that Simeon and Levi come in and just kill them all. I think George Washington learned a lesson from this, and when he fought against the German mercenaries of the Revolutionary War, he waited until Christmas and they were completely drunk out of their minds, and then he went in and did the same thing, routed them out. And so they set them up, and then they killed them all. And of course, afterwards we're told the sons of Jacob, and I don't know if it's referring just to these two, likely all of them. They came in and raided, and they just pillaged the whole city. And they just were horrible. Won't spend a lot of time discussing this. Again, I'm not an expert in the ancient Near East. I don't know if they would have been considered within their rights to do what they did. Seems unlikely. But they would have killed a lot of people. Maybe killing the offender. Certainly that would have been appropriate. But they just wiped them all out. And of course, what was Jacob's response to this? When his sons went and avenged their sisters being raped. Was he happy for them?
He was angry.
He was upset.
Because they made him a mocking stock. I mean, I'm saying laughing stock, but that's not what it is. They made him, the people of the land were then angry at him. And he had to still live in that land.
Right, yeah. So he had a moment of clarity in one sense, and he said, hey, we live around these. The Canaanites are our neighbors. We can't just be killing all of them because. But what was their response? The sons.
They shouldn't have done what they did.
Well, I said, well, you didn't do anything. Why didn't you do something? I always thought that was interesting. That they took it upon themselves.
And I think when Jacob is dying in his last words, he says, Simeon and Levi are brothers, instruments of cruelty in their dwelling place.
Yep.
And he basically condemns them because he says, let my soul not enter their council. Let my honor not be united to their assembly. For in their anger they slew a man.
Mm-hmm. More than one. Yeah, they were very violent. Jacob's response seemed to Dinah being raped. We don't have anything recorded. It seemed to be absent. So I imagine that they just decided he's not doing anything. We're going to step in and do something. And at that point, their scheme was pretty significant.
Really was the situation stink. And so, as part of that was, no one would want to deal with us. They don't know what's doing himself.
Yeah. He was finally back where he belonged, and then we got this trouble, a lot of trouble. And so we're seeing now that as this family is growing, they just seem to be embroiled in trouble, controversy, bad attitudes, poor decisions, on and on and on. Let's talk for a minute. We're going to get into Joseph. Of course, he rose to prominence. He was favored by Jacob. He was the first son of the woman he wanted to be his wife. And I don't remember where I saw this quote. Maybe Don said it, I don't know, but I wrote it down. The presence of Joseph in the home didn't create problems so much as reveal them. It's not like Joseph was a troublemaker, necessarily. We're going to talk in a minute about how he talked about his dreams and stuff, and maybe that was provocative. But there were issues in this family, even before Joseph got there, that are starting to manifest. So I have this question. What was Jacob's role in this troubled relationship?
Bragging. He bragged.
No.
Jacob.
Oh, Jake, I'm sorry.
Yeah, what? What's that?
Seems absent.
Yeah, he does. He seems like things are festering and problems are growing, and he doesn't seem to be aware of them. He absolutely showed favoritism. He provided Joseph with this special coat, the call, and he gave him, it seemed like a position of prominence. Joseph's brothers would go and work, and what was Joseph sent to do? Check on them. Yeah, go check on them, see how they're doing. Let me know, bring a report back to me. And so there's this, they were set up to have this confrontational relationship because Jacob, to me, clearly seemed to show favoritism. And again, maybe in the ancient Near East, that's acceptable, but I would imagine typically it would have been favoritism towards your firstborn. And so maybe Joseph, being the last of the ones born, at this point, shouldn't have been shown favoritism, but he certainly was. So Joseph, we're told, he brought a bad report back to Jacob about his brothers. Won't linger on this too long either, but I'm interested to know what your thoughts are. What does this say about Joseph? His dad sent him out. Hey, let's see how everybody's doing. Let me know how it's going with your brothers. How the sheep are looking. Joseph comes back with a bad report. What does that tell us about him? Is he a snitch?
I don't know what they did bad. It just depends. It's the context we weren't given. But yeah, I mean, it kind of seems to be setting us up to imply that perhaps we did not shy away from the favoritism.
Perhaps. I'll say this, as you're right, it's not written. Everything we know about Joseph otherwise, and his character, tells me that he wasn't trying to leverage, and gain more advantage. I don't gather that. I imagine the bad report was truly a bad report. It wasn't, hey, Levi was sleeping loud, and I saw him under the olive tree. It was probably bad news. So he brought a bad report. Not always easy to do. I mean, for a tattletale, it's easy to be a tattletale, but if you're going to deliver news to somebody about somebody else that's going to have some impact or some implications, that's not always an easy thing to do. You would certainly hope it's not. Let's skip over that because we're way behind. And then we get into the scene where Joseph had some dreams. You recall he had some dreams about some cows. No, that wasn't Joseph, that was the favorite. Joseph had dreams about his wheat growing taller than the others, and the others bowing down to him. Remember, and what was the point? What was the point of, or how was it interpreted by his brothers?
That Joseph would reign over them.
Yeah, you think you're more important. You think you're more important than us. You think you're better than us. You think we're going to bow to you. Of course, Joseph's dream was prophetic, was it not? But he didn't necessarily know that at the time. His brothers certainly didn't know that at the time. But they took that as just more of Joseph being smug, Joseph being the favorite, Joseph, you're thinking too highly of himself. I have wondered about this. Was he at fault for sharing these dreams? Should he have kept these dreams that demonstrate his preeminence over them? Should he have kept that just to himself?
Well, did he believe that God was giving him those dreams? And so he would tell them because he felt God gave him those dreams.
Yeah, perhaps. I don't know what I would do. I don't think I would go tell people. I have this dream where I'm in charge and you're bowing to me. Even if I thought, unless I was instructed by God to go tell the dream. So perhaps a bad decision. We talked about Joseph, and he is one of John mentioned it even recently with talking about Daniel. Joseph is one of the few people of whom nothing negative is spoken in the scriptures, and that he makes the right and difficult decisions all the time. And he perseveres through all of the suffering and all of the injustice that is done to him. This is as close as I can get. Is maybe he should have kept his mouth shut. Maybe he shouldn't have said something. Who knows how soon after the bad report this was? Maybe they were already mad at him, and so who knows? But nevertheless, on the other side of it, we see how it all worked out, don't we? We see that all of this worked together for a purpose, and that maybe Joseph telling them this was exactly what pushed them over the edge to do what they did. So long story short, they decide we're going to kill him. They're out there, they're planning on killing him. Cooler heads prevail. Let's not just kill him. Let's just sell him to slavery, and let's just be rid of him without actually killing him, because he is our brother after all. And so that's better. And so they do that. They take his special coat that Jacob gave him. Remember, they make it appear that Joseph was attacked by a wild animal. They dipped it in goat's blood and present it to Jacob. And oh, look what we found. And left Jacob to figure out in his own head what had happened to his son. And of course, Jacob went into great mourning. And he even said that he was never going to recover from this. He was going to go to his grave sad over what had happened. Then we get to this next interlude. Really weird story. Genesis 38, if you recall the story of Tamar. Tamar was the daughter-in-law of Judah. And she had married his firstborn son, We're told that was wicked and that God put him to death. Not sure what he did, but he was pretty bad. So, she says, hey, something's got to be done. Judah tells his second son, Onan, hey, you're obligated to give her an heir in the place of your brother, and to help her conceive so that she can have a child and carry on your brother's lineage. And we're told that Onan didn't do that. He chose not to do that. So he was wicked, he was put to death. And then he had a third son who was still too young. And so Judah said, well, I've got this third son, Shelah. When he's old enough, I'll send him to you to carry out what his other brother didn't do. But he had no intention of allowing this. Because what did Judah think was going to happen to Shelah as well? Yeah, he's like, well, I've got two sons, they're both dead, so not going to let this happen. And so the story jumps ahead years, and Tamar realizes Shelah's old enough now, but I haven't seen anything about him. He hasn't been around. And then she saw Judah out and about. So you recall that she concocted a scheme. She put herself in a veil, she dressed herself, and she went and she set out in his path. Judah thought she was a shrine prostitute. He was lonely. He decided to have an encounter. And remember that she said, well, what are you going to pay me? He said, I've got a goat I can give you. She said, that's great. What about until I get the goat? I want some sort of pledge from you. And he said, well, all I have is my seal and my cord and my staff. I give those to you. She said, great. The deed was done. And then remember that she took off her costume and she left with all of his stuff. And he sent the goat. And of course, they're like, where's the shrine prostitute? And everybody said, we don't have a shrine prostitute around here. And so Judah's response was, well, that's embarrassing. And so he decided to just keep everything on the down low and to not talk about it. Tamar got pregnant, which was her plan all along. Word got out. And remember, Judah's reaction was very decisive, wasn't it? He said, she should burn to death for this. How dare her be pregnant? She should burn to death. Tamar, I think, knew that was going to happen, which is why she had all this stuff from him before. So she says, yeah, okay, well, here's the stuff that belongs to the guy. If you want to find the guy that got me pregnant, here's his stuff. And of course, Judah realizes, oh, that's my stuff. Very well then. And he's like, yep, she got me. And I should have shared my third son with her. And then the scriptures tell us he chose not to sleep with her. So, strange story. I don't fully understand the story, why it's there. I suspect that even in that culture, even if sleeping with shrine prostitutes was normal or accepted, I don't think that was how God wanted it to happen. But it did happen, and one thing we know about Tamar is who is in her lineage.
Christ.
Jesus. she appears in the lineage of Jesus. So, got a couple interesting stories when we look back through his
Doesn't
heritage.
Judas say that she's more righteous
Yep.
than me? And of course, that has to refer to the Levirate law, because he had the fear of Shelah dying,
Mhm.
and he should have given her to Shelah.
Yeah, he should have. He said he was going to. He didn't. She realized, okay, this isn't right. So she took charge of the situation and took what was hers to have.
Which the other thing is, she wasn't Jewish or Israelite, right? Wasn't she?
I imagine she was of
I think she was.
Canaan. So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know what her lineage was. I suspect that she was. I mean, we know that Judah is told he went away and he intermarried with Canaan. So there you go. All right, so we get to the story of Joseph, and we won't rehash everything. We just know Joseph went through hills and valleys, sold into slavery, landed in Potiphar's house, worked his way up, got deceived by Potiphar's wife, or not deceived, got accused by Potiphar's wife of trying to take advantage of her, which was an outright lie, wasn't it? Because she was coming onto him. He must have been exceedingly handsome. And thrown in jail, and then rose through the ranks again. And so he has been faithful, and he has been steadfast through all of this. He's relied on God through all of this, and he's made all the right decisions along the way. And so, of course, we see that through all of this, it is he who is able to save his family. And when famine strikes where Israel is, they're able to come in and to be saved by him. Of course, his brothers thought, even when he revealed himself to them and they had their tearful reunion, his brothers in the back of their minds always thought, well, he's just waiting until our dad dies. He's going to be cool with us, but as soon as dad dies, we're getting what's coming to us. And of course, that's not how Joseph was. He certainly wasn't going to harm them. His motives were ultimately very pure. He didn't take revenge. We read that he set them up in the land of Goshen, which was up on the edge of the Nile Delta, a very fertile land, lots of grass, a perfect place for people with livestock to come and to settle. And they had good times for a while. They were there, they had plenty of room, they had plenty of water, they didn't have a famine. Joseph, through God's intervention, was able to get Egypt to set up and store years and years worth of provisions, so that when the famine did strike, they would be ready. So they were in a prime location, and they were under a government at that time that was very competent. Of course, because it was guided in part by God. So they prospered, and they grew, and they grew, and they grew. Within the borders of Egypt, they're growing and growing. I'll say this. There's a lot of views about how long they were in Egypt, though Exodus 14 tells us they were there 430 years. But I have found in preparing this and studying, there's a lot of people who spend a lot of time hashing out how long they were there based on clues, hashing out at what time in history they were there and who were the rulers, because that might matter, the Egyptian rulers, that is. Hashing out where exactly did they cross the Red Sea? Was it up here in a marsh? Was it actually over here in a big part of the ocean or the sea? Lots and lots of thoughts about these things, and in my mind it's interesting, but it's unimportant. What is important is that they were there, they grew as a nation, which is the fulfillment of that original promise to Abraham, that they were going to become a nation. And in Egypt they become a nation. Also a lot of discussion about how many people there actually were. Was it 200,000 or was it 3 million? What we know is it was a lot. And the Egyptian rulers even start saying, there's a lot of people there. And they're growing at a very rapid rate. And if we don't do something, we're going to have trouble. And so all we know is that they were there for a long time, and they were prospering and doing very well for a long time, and growing as a nation, and were very fruitful as God had commanded that they would be. But we know that when Joseph died, we're told there's a new Pharaoh in charge who didn't know Joseph or didn't care about Joseph. Joseph was, all that he had done was a distant memory. And now he views the Israelites as a potential threat. And they are now, and he even says, they're so big that if one of our enemies were to attack us, which was a very common thing in that part of the world in that time, there was a season to go to war and there were battles. And he said, if one of our enemies attacks us, look how many there are. They're just going to join with them and then they're going to come in with a built-in army full of people. So his decision is to throw them into slavery. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I wanted to get this, because all of this jibber-jabbering I've done was talking about the seeds of complaining. And so I want to talk for just a moment about what is our role for future generations. What impact can we have generation to generation based on maybe something that was done 2, 3, 4 generations before? The Bible talks about it, and so if you want to talk about that, we can certainly do that. But just looking at your own life's experience, how many of you are Christians because you were raised in a godly home? And how many of your parents were Christians because perhaps they were raised in a godly home? And you can maybe trace that back generations and see that one person's decision or a mother and father's decision generations ago still resonates today. Or, if you look at the other side, you've seen people who have grown up in terrible circumstances, and you almost think they had no hope because, they grew up in terrible circumstances, their parents grew up in terrible circumstances, their parents did, and you can see this one way or the other following after. And so, what's our role? What if we're in a great circumstance and we're in a godly home and we're parents, we're in a godly home and we have godly parents? What is our role this generation?
My parents, and I've said this to others, my parents were good, bad examples.
Yep.
They were not Christians in any way. It was, Mom would make us go to church, but she wouldn't. And there were battles within the household because I don't want to go to church. You're going to church. Things like that.
Yep.
Well, because I met Julie, I became a Christian. But my attitude is gratefulness and thankfulness, and I hope I exude that to the rest of my family, so that they don't, hopefully not, I'm not a bad example to them.
Sure. So, you were the other question. If we're in a good situation, our responsibility is to keep it going, is to not squander it. A lot of people grow up and my parents are lame. They go to church. They don't want me to do this or that, and they break away. But keep it going. And of course, if you're in a bad circumstance like yours was, I think it was bad, different, suboptimal, then break away, break out of it. But where I'm going with this is in Deuteronomy 6. Of course, we have this passage that Moses is encouraging the Israelites when they're ready to, they're getting close to the promised land. He says in Deuteronomy 6, "This is the command, the statutes, and the ordinances the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you, so that you may follow them in the land you are about to enter and possess. Do this so that you may fear the Lord your God all the days of your life by keeping all his statutes and commands I am giving you, your son and your grandson, and so that you may have a long life. Listen, Israel, and be careful to follow them so that you may prosper and multiply greatly, because the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you a land flowing with milk and honey. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These words that I'm giving you today are to be in your heart. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them be a symbol on your forehead. and on and on. And so there Moses is telling them, you had some bad forefathers who didn't make it here. You guys got here. We're about to go in and take what was promised to us. Put it in your heart, and then put it in your children's heart and in your grandchildren's heart. Pass it down. And so he's encouraging them, have a generation, let this be the generation where it changes, where all of the bad habits and all of the bad attitudes change. And did that work?
A little while.
A little while, and then it fell apart again. And so maybe that's just how people are. But that is certainly what our responsibility is if, especially if we're in a dysfunctional situation, is to figure our way out of that. And I am not wise enough to tell you how to do that, but that's what it is. All right, so now they're slaves. They went from being protected by Joseph, by prospering and growing and living a good life, though not in the promised land, but still growing in this environment where the nation can grow and prosper, to being enslaved. And we read in Exodus chapter 1, we get the story of why they're enslaved. Starting in verse 6. Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation eventually died. But the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them. The new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, came to power in Egypt. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, otherwise they will multiply further. And when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramses as supply cities for Pharaoh, but the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. They worked the Israelites ruthlessly and made their lives bitter with difficult labor in brick and mortar and in all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all this work on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, I'll stop there. That's another story. So we're told this new Pharaoh is just fearful. They've gotten huge. He doesn't know Joseph. He doesn't understand the relationship. And so he sees them now as a threat and a potential enemy. And the solution is we're going to enslave them and just make their lives miserable. And hopefully, the thought was if we keep them miserable, they won't be able to continue to grow as a nation. Because when you're tired, that's what you do. You go to bed and sleep. And you don't have babies. And he's thinking, we're going to fix this. And of course, it didn't have that effect. It had the opposite effect. But they were tasked, we're told, with building these two cities, Pithom and Ramses. And you can see on the map where they are. So the land of Goshen is this area here. And so these cities would have been within that land. Told they were being built as store cities. Here's a couple depictions of ancient Ramses. And it wasn't just a big warehouse. It was an actual city. They were used as store cities. There was lots of storage there. But these also would have had temples. They would have had residences and so on. There's a depiction of that city, which was on one of the branches of the Nile, in the Nile Delta. There's an excavation scene of Ramses now. And so you can still see, even by what's left, there was a lot there that they were tasked with building. I couldn't find any pictures or drawings of Pithom, but there it is. A little less grand, perhaps, but you can really see here the bricks, the mud bricks that they were tasked with making. And found this interesting picture while I was preparing this class. This was a painting from inside the tomb of an Egyptian official whose name was Nephir, and he was the governor of Thebes. And this is an actual depiction of the brick-making process, of people grabbing the mud and scooping it out, and baking it, and forming it, and then you can see here carrying off these large bricks. And so I thought that was interesting. And this would have been probably, he would have lived around the time that the Israelites would have been in there, most likely. And so those could be Israelites for all we know, or just other slaves that they had doing the job. But their job was to build these cities. And of course, as they grew and as their condition grew worse and worse, They cried out, and it says, they groaned in their slavery and cried out. And God looked on the Israelites and was concerned. So he heard their cries. They had become so oppressed and in such terrible circumstances that God has finally said, I hear them, I'm ready to take action. He selected Moses and Aaron to speak for them. Remember, Moses went and said, hey, we want to leave for a few days and go worship our God and sacrifice to him in the desert. And Pharaoh's response was brutal. If you read Exodus chapter 5, he said, what was his response? He said, you're lazy. And then what did he do to further punish them?
Then they had to gather their own straw.
Yeah. They were harvesting the mud and the clay and making the bricks, but they were smashing them with straw that was given to them. He said, you have to start getting the straw yourself, and your quota doesn't go down at all. So now their work has grown even more. And of course, at this point, what do they do to Moses? They're like, you're just making things worse for us. Please don't represent us anymore, Moses. And so at this point, Moses intercedes, talks to God. God says, okay, it's time for me to show my power. He sends the plagues. Of course, the final plague is the plague of the death of the firstborn. The Egyptians get the point. They beg them to leave. They hand them all their silver and gold on the way out. And we see that they plunder them. But they run into a wall of water. They run into a wall, and they're hemmed in, and we'll read about this next time in Exodus 14, but things are just now getting bad for the Israelites, the complaining and the groaning. They had legitimate complaints before, but now we're going to see next time they start having some pretty petty complaints. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate your comments. We'll pick this up on Sunday morning.